I sat before the grate last night and watched the fires gleam. Before me passed the olden times. It seemed just like a dream. Faces and forms of my younger days, scenes long past and gone, came trooping by in an endless stream to the tune of an endless song. It was the song of the gravity wheels, of pulleys and ropes and gear, a song that came softly as from afar, though the touch to my heart was near.
The story of the Delaware and Hudson Company's Gravity Railroad begins with coal, black diamonds. Among the few states that contain coal reserves, Pennsylvania has been endowed with vast deposits of this compressed and hardened organic material. Bituminous coal is mined in the western part of the state. The east is home to a harder and hotter burning kind of coal called anthracite. The four largest deposits, or fields, of anthracite are found in the valley beds and foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in the eastern part of the state. At one time, these coal beds contained more than 80% of the world's hard coal. Residents of eastern Pennsylvania began discovering outcroppings of anthracite in the years following the American Revolution. When their first crude experiments with the mysterious material hinted at its tremendous potential as a hot-burning, smoke-free, and long-lasting fuel, entrepreneurs swung into action. Here were seemingly inexhaustible stores of what they called stone coal, and not far away, strung along the eastern seaboard, were the bustling port towns of New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, each with its own insatiable appetite for fuel. The entrepreneurs' earliest efforts to market anthracite on a large scale were focused on Pennsylvania's middle and lower coal fields in the Lehigh and Schuylkill valleys. These deposits were within easiest reach of the young nation's former capital city of Philadelphia. The first small shipments of coal were hauled to Philadelphia over rough roads and rocky rivers. To allow for larger payloads, businessmen joined forces in the early 1800s to build canals. These man-made rivers tied into natural waterways to create far-reaching transportation systems. Among the earliest in Pennsylvania were the Union Canal, the Schuylkill Navigation, and the Pennsylvania Canal. Together, they were capable of floating 1 million tons of black diamonds each year from Lehigh and Schuylkill Valley coal fields into Philadelphia. But that was only half the battle. Coal merchants also had to convince a skeptical public that anthracite was not the latest boondoggle, that it was actually better than other fuels then in use, including wood, charcoal, and bituminous coal. The public only seemed interested in the fact that stone coal was notoriously difficult to ignite, and it was almost impossible to keep burning in conventional fireplaces and stoves. The widespread acceptance and use of anthracite would only be possible with the development of open grates and stoves specially designed for coal burning. Meanwhile, little attention was paid to the more remote northern coal field, part of which lay within the sparsely settled Lackawanna Valley. Because these deposits were farther away from Philadelphia, and because the intervening miles were filled with mountains, swamps, and other natural obstacles, hauling Lackawanna coal to Philadelphia was difficult and expensive. Beyond that, coal merchants from the Lehigh and Schuylkill valleys were already starting to flood the Delaware Valley with anthracite. New York City, on the other hand, was a relatively untapped market, and it was no farther from the Lackawanna Valley than Philadelphia. Between the Hudson River Valley and the Lackawanna Valley, however, lay a formidable expanse of mountainous terrain. It would take them several years, but a couple of enterprising brothers of Swiss ancestry would finally figure out how to make a profit from the Lackawanna Valley's remote coal resources. Maurice Wirtz and his younger brother William Wirtz had established themselves as prosperous clothing merchants in Philadelphia. As partial payment on a contract to supply the United States Army with uniforms during the War of 1812, they were granted a large tract of land in the wilderness of northeastern Pennsylvania. While scouting out their newly acquired territory, Maurice and William Wirtz learned of the area's vast potential as a source of coal. The brothers set about quietly buying up more property in the vicinity. Once they had gained the rights to many acres of prime coal land, the Wirtz brothers approached the famed engineer of the Erie Canal, Benjamin Wright, and asked him to devise a way of getting their coal from the Lackawanna Valley over to the Hudson River, where it could be shipped to points north and, most importantly, down to New York City. Under Wright's supervision, a route was laid out in 1823, working backward from New York City. From the Hudson River village of Rondout, plans called for the building of a canal up along Rondout Creek, as far as the west side of the Shawangunk Mountains, then down the valley of the Neversink River to the Delaware River, which there marked New York State's western border with Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, the canal would be extended up the Delaware to the Lackawaxen River, and then up the Lackawaxen to the mouth of Dybury Creek. There, with but 17 miles to go to reach William and Maurice Wirtz's little mining settlement called Carbondale, the proposed canal stopped and could go no further. Between the mouth of Dybury Creek and Carbondale stood an imposing obstacle, Moosic Mountain, towering more than 1,000 feet over the surrounding countryside. There was a small notch in its crest known as Ricks's Gap, but even this sat a seemingly inaccessible 950 feet above the canal route. In the summer of 1825, as squads of Irish and German immigrants began blasting and digging out the first sections of the canal, engineers for the Wirtz brothers and the corporation they helped to form, called the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company, were still puzzling over how to get what they hoped would be large quantities of Lackawanna coal across Moosic Mountain. The company's chief engineer, as of 1827, John B. Jervis, finally settled on a technique that had been partly developed a few years earlier in a British mine. It called for using steam-powered locomotives to pull coal wagons on rails up gradual inclines, then stationary steam engines to pull them up short and steep inclines, then letting gravity take the wagons down longer declines. Construction on Jervis's unusual 16-mile railroad between Carbondale and Honesdale began in December of 1827. Steam-powered railroads were new to America, and locomotives were not yet being built here. So Jervis sent his bright 25-year-old protege, Horatio Allen, to England, where he could study its few steam-powered railroads and order the building of one or more locomotives for the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company. Allen contracted for 4 locomotives, and they began arriving in New York Harbor in early 1829. One of the engines had been dubbed the Sturbridge Lion, as it had been built in the English town of Sturbridge and was decorated on its rounded boiler front with the painted head of a lion. The Sturbridge Lion was floated over the recently completed Delaware and Hudson Canal to its terminus at the mouth of Dybury Creek, where the little settlement of Honesdale was taking shape. Here, on a 3-mile stretch of track, the engine was scheduled for a trial run on August the 8th. At the Lion's controls on the day of its maiden voyage was none other than Horatio Allen. The Lion performed splendidly, but incredibly, it proved too heavy for the Gravity Railroad's track bed and trestles. John Jervis had designed the line for engines no heavier than 6.5 tons. Somehow, even with Horatio Allen supplying precise instructions, the British manufacturer had built the Lion so it weighed in at 7 tons. After a second brief trial run confirmed their fears, company officials gave up on the Lion and pushed their splendid giant off onto a sidetrack. Neither it nor its 3 equally overweight companions would ever work on the Gravity Railroad. History, however, had been made. The Sturbridge Lion's initial excursion ranked as the first running of a steam-powered locomotive on a working railway anywhere in America. With his locomotive plans sidetracked, John Jervis called in the horses. The last piece of rail was laid on his Gravity Railroad that summer of 1829, and with the aid of horsepower, stationary steam engines, and even one engine driven by a water wheel, the first loaded coal cars began crossing Moosic Mountain in early October. By the end of the year, using a few dozen coal cars and canal boats, the D&H Company moved 7,000 tons of coal into Honesdale. Within 10 years, the company had placed into service 275 railroad cars and 130 canal boats capable of hauling more than 120,000 tons of Lackawanna coal from the mines around Carbondale to the mouth of the Hudson River each year. There had been a time when Maurice Wirtz considered moving 100,000 tons a year an ambitious but realistic goal. What must he have thought when the company's total for 1848 was projected to exceed 500,000 tons? Though gratified by their company's successes, Delaware and Hudson directors were far from satisfied. There was a lot more money to be made if they could open more mines, extend the railroad to meet them, and increase the overall carrying capacity of the line. That prospect frightened and angered the growing number of small independent mine operators in the region. To Lackawanna businessmen and community leaders, the outsiders of the D&H Company appeared bent on gaining a stranglehold on their region's economy by monopolizing the business of transporting coal. As D&H directors authorized small improvements to the railroad and mine connections, charges and rebuttals flew back and forth in court proceedings and in the press. Public relations skirmishes continued for years, but by 1842 the company had most of its legal battles won. With the close of the canal season that year, officials commissioned a major overhaul of their system, and workers began enlarging the canal to allow for boats with bigger payloads. Meanwhile, James Archibald, the company's astute Scottish-born superintendent, made plans for the extension of the Gravity Railroad southwestward from Carbondale, down along the Lackawanna River, into the Lackawanna Valley, where more and more anthracite coal mines were being opened. Under Archibald's supervision, the railroad was first extended 7 miles down to recently opened mines, where White Oak Run flowed into the Lackawanna River. The second extension, completed in 1859, took the railroad another 6 miles down to Valley Junction. Here it would meet a standard locomotive-powered railroad the company was building down to the outskirts of Scranton. By early 1861, as the nation teetered on the brink of civil war, the Gravity Railroad had been extended to a length of 30 miles, and the system had been fitted out with 2 tracks, one for loaded cars headed eastward, and a second for light or empty cars making the return trip. Company officials inspecting the improvements could take pride not only in the success of their enterprise, but also in the dramatic economic and social transformation the Gravity Railroad was working on the surrounding countryside. Coal trains were now pulled up the mountain and let down the other side on 28 planes. The western flanks of Moosic Mountain were now dotted with breakers, towering processing plants where coal was noisily crushed into usable pieces and foreign materials were removed primarily by hand. Between Valley Junction and Carbondale, the Gravity Railroad had spawned a string of mining and coal shipping villages, including Oliphant, Peckville, Jessup, Winton, Archbald, Gibsonburg, later known as German, and Mayfield. The largest of these settlements was Archbald, end of the line for the first gravity railroad extension in 1847. The village had grown up around two dominant mining operations: the White Oak Mine, opened by the D&H Company and now owned by Judge Birdseye of New York, and a mine on the opposite side of the Lackawanna River operated by Eaton and Company. But even busy Archbald was dwarfed by Carbondale. The phenomenal growth of the 40-year-old Lackawanna coal mining industry was nowhere more dramatically exemplified. From a handful of log cabins in 1820, Carbondale had grown into an incorporated village of 600 inhabitants in little more than a decade. Now it was a full-fledged city, the first one established in northeastern Pennsylvania, and it had become a center of agricultural and lumber trade, as well as the hub of mining and transportation enterprises. More than 1 million tons of coal each year were now leaving Carbondale and passing Racket Brook Breaker on a trip over Moosic Mountain via Ricks's Gap, which the D&H Company had renamed Farview. On the east side of the mountain, cars coasted down through the borough of Waymart and then past Keene's Pond. Eventually, they arrived in Honesdale, bustling metropolis of 2,500 souls, capital of Wayne County. Here, Gravity Railroad met Canal, and down at the docks, coal was transferred from coal car to canal boat. From there, it was sent off on its long journey to the Hudson River at Kingston, New York. From Kingston, coal was shipped either northward to Albany and the Erie Canal, or down the Hudson to the company's recently constructed docks at Weehawken, New Jersey. Most of this coal eventually found its way into the furnaces and grates of factories and homes across the river in New York City, where the appetite for anthracite grew even stronger during 4 years of Civil War and the period of Reconstruction which followed. Even the waters around the city represented a market for Lackawanna coal, as Delaware and Hudson agents convinced steamboat operators to fuel their engines with coal rather than wood. In 1872, the company set a new standard by bringing nearly 3 million tons of coal to market. Only a third of that coal arrived via the Gravity Railroad, however. The company's growing network of regular locomotive-powered railroads made the once proud Gravity Railroad and canal system appear more antiquated with every passing year. In an attempt to profit from the Gravity Railroad's unique character, the company decided to try supplementing the railroad's coal revenues with proceeds from passengers. In 1877, it began running passenger trains of 3 or 4 coaches between Carbondale and Honesdale 6 times each day. Lured by the promise of spectacular scenery and a spine-tingling but safe-guarded ride, tourists flocked to the Gravity in astonishing numbers. At its peak of passenger service in the mid-1890s, the railroad provided thrills for nearly 15,000 excursionists on its busiest summer days. Those who tried to relate their experiences to friends back home found themselves choosing their words very carefully.
The car we entered was elaborately furnished, but it was less than half the size of an ordinary railroad car. It moved out from the covered depot a few yards and stopped. We looked out and saw the narrow track leading directly up the side of the hill at a sharp angle. A brakeman stood on the front platform of the car and slipped a big iron hook into a sling attached to the car. Then a coal-begrimed workman seized the end of the wire and gave it 2 or 3 savage jerks. Instantly the car started and was soon rushing up the hill at a rate of 20 miles an hour.
The coal breakers and mountains of dust and debris from the mines was a wonderment to the uninitiated.
We were headed to the park called both Fairview and Farview. A tower on the pinnacle of the mountain is said to bring 13 lakes into view. It is said one can see into 4 different states with a glass on a clear day, and upon an unrivaled view of lake, mountain, and valley in a nearer view.
At Farview, the wind swept grandly and soothingly over the ridge, and its coolness was delicious. The view from every point picturesque and charming. From the people in our party, I heard only a united expression of complete satisfaction.
The ride up the mountain was not only novel, but decidedly entertaining, and greatly enjoyed by everyone. The ladies in our party said it recalled younger days, when they used to sled down the hill, and their big brother or sweetheart drew the sled back up the hill for them.
The ride from Farview to Carbondale was over an uninterrupted declining grade. The road curved abruptly around projecting hills, clung to the sides of rocky ledges, and spanned deep chasms by airy but substantial trestles. On this ride down the mountain, the trains frequently ran a mile a minute.
About 2 miles from Carbondale, we saw a track running parallel with the one we were on, a rod or 2 away, but several feet below us. This must be some rival railroad line, we thought at first. It was only a few moments, however, before we found our car on the same track. This was the Shepherd's Crook.
Of Carbondale, I need only say it is a coal mining city with the dust, smoke, and noise inseparable from its business. The railroad, with its begrimed cars above and below, with its grim mine holes staring us in the face, remind us of the terrors of the lower world.
Passenger service prolonged the life of the gravity railroad, but it couldn't sustain it forever. It was so much cheaper now to move coal around a mountain on a standard railway than it was to drag it up and over a few carloads at a time. The writing was on the wall. Whether they realized it or not, passengers making the excursion in 1898 were witnessing the winter of the gravity's long and productive life. In October 1898, the managers of the Delaware and Hudson Canal and Railroad Company took a hard look at their bottom line and decided to shut down their gravity railroad and canal system. Photographers scrambled to record a series of lasts. The last excursion train leaving Carbondale. The last of the coal pile in Honesdale. The last shovelful of coal dumped into the last coal car. The last D&H canal boats being filled. And then, on November 5th, 1898, the very last loaded coal boat of the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company ready to leave Honesdale. Nearly 70 years after the first coal cars began climbing Moosic Mountain, the last coal cars were pushed into piles and set ablaze. To the accompaniment of crackling flames, the curtain came down on a remarkable American institution. In the years that have passed since the abandonment of the gravity railroad, most of its elements have disappeared from the landscape. Little more than scattered remnants survive to remind area residents they are living in the gravity's historic shadow. Here, a lone-standing bridge abutment. There, a weed and leaf-covered foundation of an engine house. Elsewhere, a strip of neglected right-of-way stretching off into the distance. Only a few precious relics remain in the public eye. Front and center is the office building of the D&H Company in Honesdale, which has been given a conspicuous new lease on life.
We're here in Honesdale, Pennsylvania, and our museum is the Wayne County Historical Society Museum, and the purpose of our museum, of course, is to preserve the history of the county. were fortunate enough to be housed in the original office of the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company.
The museum's main exhibition area, a recent addition to the former office building, accommodates a full-sized replica of the historic Sturbridge Lion and a restored D&H passenger car called the Eclipse.
Where we're sitting in the Eclipse passenger car. It was built in 1882, and we're fortunate to have it here. The Sturbridge Lion replica that we have here in the museum was built in 1923 in preparation for the celebration of the 100th anniversary of its original running.
While most remnants of the gravity railroad farther off the beaten track have been demolished or left to deteriorate, a few have had their lives prolonged.
We're located near the top of lift plane 27 of the Delaware and Hudson Gravity Railroad, which was constructed between 1847 and 1860.
On Moosic Mountain above Archbald, a gravity railroad cut blasted out of solid rock nearly 1.5 centuries ago was found to be lying in the path of the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation's planned Lackawanna Valley Industrial Highway.
During the preliminary engineering phases of the project, we early on identified this extant feature of the gravity railroad, and one of our proposed corridors, which was essentially selected for construction, was moved approximately 800 feet to avoid this feature and thus avoid an adverse impact to a significant resource.
While physical remnants of the gravity railroad are today few and far between, the cultural effects of the historic system are everywhere, though they are often overlooked. Some concerned citizens of the Lackawanna region are trying to increase the public's appreciation of the gravity's extraordinary legacy.
We're standing today at the Lackawanna Heritage Valley Crossing. This footbridge is located at the site of the Delaware and Hudson Gravity Railroad bridge that once crossed the river at this location. The bridge is the beginning of the 40-mile Lackawanna River Heritage Trail that's being built along the river through the valley by the Lackawanna River Corridor Association and the Lackawanna Heritage Valley Authority. This partnership effort is involving the communities up and down the river in restoring some of the abandoned railways that parallel the Lackawanna River and restoring some of the historical and cultural links between our communities to enhance the river corridor and promote it as a recreational asset for our communities.
Once the economic backbone of the region, the Delaware and Hudson Company's remarkable gravity railroad is now a faint and flickering memory. A century has passed since its wheels stopped turning, but the story of the gravity's rise and fall continues to be told. Echoes of its music linger still.
It was the song of the gravity wheels, of pulleys and ropes and gear. A song that came softly as from afar, though the touch to my heart was near.
Thank you.